guys, so we're on our second video lecture, 1.2, Developments in Dar al-Islam. We're going to be talking about the Umayyads and the Abbasids as the major focus of our lecture for today. So just to give you a little bit of background, the Islamic conquest began in 634, and they would go until about 711 CE. And the Islamic conquests of areas outside Arabia began in the 7th century. In the first wave of conquest, the Arabs took Syria, Egypt, and the Sassanid Empire. In the late 7th and then the early 8th centuries, Islamic forces took Spain, Algeria, and Morocco. And the most convincing explanations of how quickly Muslims were able to advance is down to the talent of their leaders and then the structure of Arab society. During the period of expansion, the Arab forces were organized into regular paid armies and kept in military camps and garrison towns so they didn't actually overrun the countryside. And this was a pretty radical new way of carrying out battle tactics. The Arab Muslims became minority rulers. They were quite thinly spread out over non-Muslim societies that they dominated and taxed, but did not try to convert. And that is actually one of the reasons why they were more accepted as rulers in the areas that they conquered throughout Asia and down into Africa, is they didn't force anyone to convert, and actually quite the opposite. They didn't want to force people to convert. They only wanted true believers. That brings us to the Umayyads. So again, stressing on the importance of the fact that we know the Umayyads ruled an Arab empire, not a Muslim empire. They administered their territory through the established Sassanid and Byzantine apparatus. Gradually, they brought in Muslim bureaucrats and the Arabic language. They built their capital city in Damascus, and it was actually here that they built the Great Mosque over a Christian church with the relics of John the Baptist. And what's important to note is that even though they built the mosque over the church, they didn't destroy it. And that fell under a rule that the term people of the book, and that encompassed Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and actually Zoroastrians at times as well, you did not enslave or destroy the places of worship of people of the book. And if you study religion, you'll find that there's a lot of overlapping figures in each of the holy texts. The Umayyads continued their conquest of North Africa, and North Africa was eventually divided into two regions. So Egypt to the east, and then Maghreb to the west. And by the 10th century, the Muslims had become the majority in both of these places. Rebellions would eventually overthrow the Umayyads in 750. They were a rather short-lived caliphate. One branch of the family, however, would actually remain in power. So the Umayyads had territory in the Arabian Peninsula, throughout Western Asia, down into North Africa, and into parts of Europe. And one branch of the Umayyad family was able to stay in power in Spain. And this is very important to remember for two reasons. One of these reasons is right on the screen in front of you. This is the beautiful Palace Alhambra. It is still standing. It is open to the public to tour. If you ever find yourself in Granada, Spain, I strongly suggest you take a day and visit this place. It is beautiful. Not just in terms of its architecture and its artwork, but it really shows how advanced the Umayyads were when it came to technology, because this place had running water, folks. It had indoor plumbing, and if you wanted to take a bath, there was hot water ready for you at your convenience. How amazing is that? The expansion of the Umayyads, however, was halted by the Battle of Tours. All right. So let's talk about the Abbasids. They are the ones who overthrew the Umayyads. And upon their fall, the family of Abbas, who was an uncle of Muhammad, took over and established the Abbasid Caliphate. And they would actually hold the caliphate until 1258. They provided renewed religious leadership, and they combined that with a style that actually came from the Sassanids. Literature and learning included the translation of Greek texts as well as secular Arab poetry, and it thrived under the Abbasids. Like, guys, you have to know that Europe is in the Dark Ages. They've lost that connection to the ancient Greek and Roman texts, and these texts were saved by the Abbasids, and they were translated into Arabic. That's going to come in. It's going to be very important to note later on, guys. Under the Abbasids, their capital city was Baghdad. And Baghdad at first was the center of Abbasid culture. And it was the place to be. This is where the learning happened. This is where trading happened. But guys, then it expanded. And Baghdad wasn't just the center of Abbasid culture, it became the Islamic center of the world. And then, I'm not done yet, and then Baghdad became the educational center of the world. It was on par with the city of Chang'an under the Tang. Baghdad was the place to be, and the universities that were established in Baghdad actually became the model for universities that would be built later in Europe. All roads lead to Rome, all roads lead to Chang'an, and now all roads lead to Baghdad. The Abbasid period saw an acceleration of the rate of conversion of non-Muslim subjects to Islam in the 9th century. And as a result, the Islamic world saw the rise of a very diverse ruling elite. The capital city of Baghdad was actually built by the second Abbasid Caliph, so it would remain their capital city for the majority of the survival of this caliph. And it was in this city that the world's first workable decimal system was actually created. So I want you guys just to see all the territory here. That's impressive. So in addition to this city having the first workable decimal system, you also have the invention of the astrolabe to calculate location on Earth. A paper-making factory was opened. The growth of cotton crops spread from Persia to Egypt and West Africa. In the 8th century, only about roughly 8% of the people living under Abbasid rule were Muslims. And the caliph would actually establish a judicial system throughout the empire. Abbasid society was very interesting. Except for the privileged status of the royal family, it was very egalitarian. So that was our vocab word from last week. People were equal. And continuing on with traditions, the Abbasid rulers increasingly adopted Sasanian traditions of royal privilege. Some groups were more honored and respected than others. And how much people followed the tenets of Islam varied from person to person, because Islam was more easily adapted into existing and established cultural traditions in a lot of the areas it would reach than other religions were. And this is where we get the concept of Dar al-Islam, meaning that regardless of cultural differences, people are united under the religion of Islam. Because of its location, having the capital city of Baghdad increased the amount of long-distance trade within the empire as a whole. And as a result of this, merchants were very respected within the Abbasid culture. So it's not just the military conquests that spread Arab culture and that spread Islam, it was merchants. So again, given Baghdad's location, right here, you have people coming and going, and merchants, the revival of the Silk Road, you've got ports for Indian Ocean trade, you have trans-Saharan trade. Merchants are carrying religion with them, and they're spreading it with them. And they're respected as a result of that, but they're also respected because the Prophet Muhammad was a merchant. When looking at slavery, trade in slaves made up a very large part of the long-distance trade. But it provided an opportunity for Muslims to convert other people because the Quran forbid enslaving fellow Muslims. So if a slave converted, they had to be freed. But Abbasid power eventually began to decline in the second half of the 9th century. A couple of reasons here, guys. For one, the empire was very large. So we called it the Abbasid Caliphate. The rulers were Muslim, but the majority of their subjects were not, at least at first. And that's really important to remember. But Their caliphate was so large, it just became too hard to control, and we see that happening again and again. One factor in the decline of their power was the difficulty of transportation and communications. The further you were away from the city of Baghdad, which was not just the cultural center, the educational center, the economic center, the political center, guys, the further away you got from that, the more difficult it was to maintain power over your subjects. That makes sense. And we've seen that happen throughout history. And guess what? I'm not done talking about it. You're going to hear about it again later. It's a trend. In the 9th century, local revolts carved the Abbasid realm into much smaller states. And these states didn't pay taxes or really owe any form of loyalty to Baghdad. So that's an issue. In Baghdad, the caliphs had come to rely on a group of people. So they were Turkish slave troops known as the Mamluks. But there were some financial issues and they weren't actually paid. So what happened is there was a revolt and they ended up taking control of the caliphate, and they chose whomever they wanted to be the caliph and then dominated the government. So what we see happening is the Abbasid caliphate still exists, but the ruling family has been overthrown and replaced by somebody else. We'll see this happening quite a few times. The caliphate would fall under control of the Iranian Umayyads, and then it would continue to decline, and various provisional regimes rose to power. Most famously, we see the Seljuk Turks conquering Baghdad in 1055, but also the Fatimids in Egypt would establish their own smaller caliphate in what was once Abbasid territory. The Kingdom of Ghana, which had actually been beneficial of trans-Saharan trade, would eventually fall. The Umayyads in Spain were still holding power, but eventually what would happen is the entire caliphate would collapse. What we would see happening is not just the Seljuk Turks establishing the Seljuk Sultanate, not just the Fatimids establishing their own caliphate in Egypt. We would eventually see the Mongols arrive in 1258 and destroy the city. We also see interaction between Europe and the Abbasids for the first time through the Crusades. And what's interesting, guys, is the Crusades had a much greater impact on Europeans than it did on the Abbasids. And that is because the Europeans were in the Dark Ages. I mean, guys, the Abbasids had plumbing. It was the golden age of learning. Baghdad was the city to be. And during the Crusades, Europeans were exposed to those lost Greek and Roman texts, and they brought a lot of that knowledge back with them to Europe. So the Crusades pulled Europe out of the Dark Ages, and therefore I give you the Renaissance. So thanks for listening, guys. If you have any questions, send me an email. Otherwise, cheers, y'all.